In the bustling village of Obodo Oma, nestled amidst the lush, rolling hills of Nigeria's Igbo heartland, there lived a young man named Obinna who was infamous throughout the region for his endless and unquenchable appetite. From the moment he opened his eyes each morning to the moment he closed them at night, Obinna was in a constant state of consuming food, always hungry for more. The son of a respected local farmer, Obinna had been blessed with a sturdy, well-built frame from a young age, which allowed him to pack away prodigious amounts of sustenance without appearing to gain a single ounce of weight. While the other children in the village were content to nibble politely on their morning akara and afternoon plates of EBA and soup, Obinna would demolish multiple servings, licking his fingers and eyeing the leftovers on his playmates' plates. As Obinna grew older, his appetite only seemed to increase. By the time he reached his late teens, he had developed a reputation among the villagers as a voracious and insatiable eater, capable of devouring enough food to feed an entire family in one sitting. Whenever the village women would gather to prepare a communal feast for a special occasion, they would secretly groan in dismay, knowing that Obinna would be there to clean out every last morsel. "That boy has the appetite of a dozen men," the elders would whisper to each other, shaking their heads in a mixture of amazement and exasperation as they watched Obinna devour plate after plate, his cheeks bulging and his eyes gleaming with unconcealed delight. How will he ever find a wife to take care of him with a stomach that big? Indeed, Obinna's gluttony had become a source of ongoing concern and consternation for the entire community. During important village meetings and ceremonies, he would frequently interrupt the proceedings to inquire about when the next meal would be served, unable to focus on the task at hand due to the constant rumbling of his cavernous belly. The chiefs and elders would purse their lips in irritation, casting sidelong glances at the young man as he fidgeted impatiently in his seat, his gaze fixed hungrily on the kitchen area. And Obinna's insatiable hunger extended far beyond just the communal meals and feasts. He could often be found sneaking into the kitchens of the various family compounds, filching choice morsels and delicacies meant for the entire household. The village women would chase him away with brooms and ladles, scolding him for his shameless thievery, but Obinna would simply grin mischievously and scamper off, the stolen goods safely tucked away in the folds of his clothing. "That boy has no shame," the mothers would lament to one another, exasperated. "He eats like a wild animal, with no regard for anyone else. How will he ever find a wife who can keep up with his endless appetite?" Yet despite the villagers' growing concern and consternation, Obinna remained blissfully unconcerned about the impact of his gluttonous behavior. He simply couldn't understand why everyone was so worked up about his eating habits. In his mind, he was merely satisfying a natural, healthy need. After all, didn't the elders always preach the importance of maintaining one's strength and vigor through a robust diet? And didn't the village celebrate the arrival of the yam harvest each year with grand feasts and revelries? Obinna saw no contradiction between these cultural values and his own prodigious consumption. "I'm just doing what comes naturally to me," he would often say with a shrug, his mouth already half full as he spoke. "A growing boy needs his food, doesn't he?" The villagers, however, were far less sanguine about Obinna's perspective. They had all grown up with the traditional Igbo teachings about the virtues of moderation, discipline, and restraint when it came to one's appetites. The idea of someone indulging their desires so brazenly, with such little regard for the needs of the broader community, was seen as a grave moral failing. "Gluttony is a sin," the elders would mutter darkly, glaring at Obinna as he continued to gorge himself, seemingly oblivious to their disapproval. "It is a mark of poor character and weak willpower. A true man controls his urges, not the other way around." And so the tensions simmered in Obodo Oma, with the villagers growing increasingly exasperated by Obinna's bottomless appetite and the young man himself remaining stubbornly defiant in the face of their criticisms. It was a standoff that seemed to have no resolution in sight, as the community struggled to find a way to curb Obinna's gluttony without resorting to drastic measures. One day, however, the situation reached a boiling point. It was the height of the yam harvest season, and the village women had been toiling for weeks to prepare a grand celebratory feast. Every family had contributed their finest tubers, along with an array of other delicacies like smoked fish, palm oil stew, and homemade gari. The elders had laid out specific instructions for the distribution of the food, ensuring that there would be enough for everyone to partake. But when the time came for the feast to commence, Obinna arrived early and positioned himself at the front of the line, his eyes gleaming with barely contained anticipation. As the women began to serve out the portions, Obinna simply refused to move, shoving aside any of the other villagers who dared to try and cut in front of him. "I've been waiting all day for this feast," he bellowed, his voice booming across the bustling square. "I'm not letting anyone else take my share. I need to eat." The other villagers were aghast at Obinna's brazen display of selfishness, and they began to protest loudly. But Obinna remained steadfast, using his considerable size and strength to bully his way to the front of the line. Soon, a full-blown altercation had broken out, with the women desperately trying to maintain order and the elders shouting angrily at Obinna to step aside. It was in the midst of this chaotic scene that the village chief, a respected and venerable elder named Namdi, finally intervened. Raising his hands to quiet the crowd, he fixed Obinna with a stern, penetrating gaze. "Obinna, my son," he said, his voice low and measured, "your behavior here today has brought great shame and dishonor to our community. You have shown no respect for the traditions and values that we hold dear. Your endless gluttony and selfishness have become a burden that we can no longer bear." Obinna opened his mouth to protest, but the chief raised his hand, silencing him. "It is time for you to face the consequences of your actions," Namdi continued. "The elders have deliberated, and we have decided that you must be punished for the good of the entire village." At these words, a ripple of murmurs and whispers went through the crowd. The villagers exchanged nervous glances, wondering what fate might befall the young man who had so flagrantly defied the community's norms. Namdi raised his hand again, commanding silence. "Obinna," he said, "from this day forward, you will no longer be free to indulge your insatiable appetite as you have in the past. We will see to it that your gluttony is brought under control, one way or another." With that, the chief turned and gestured to two burly men who had been standing off to the side. They stepped forward and firmly grasped Obinna by the arms, restraining him as he struggled in vain against their powerful grip. "Take him away," Namdi ordered, his voice ringing with a note of finality. "The elders have spoken, and our decision is final." As the two men began to drag Obinna away, the young man's eyes went wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. "What are you going to do to me?" he cried out, his voice laced with a desperate edge. "I haven't done anything wrong. I was just hungry, that's all." But the villagers only regarded him with a mixture of pity and contempt, shaking their heads at his stubborn refusal to acknowledge the gravity of his transgressions. "You will see," Obinna Namdi said, his expression hardening. "In time, you will understand the error of your ways. And when that day comes, perhaps then you will be able to find the self-control and discipline that you have so sorely lacked." With those parting words, the chief turned and strode away, leaving Obinna to be dragged off by the two burly men, his cries of protest echoing across the now silent square. The feast, which had been so eagerly anticipated, was quickly abandoned as the villagers dispersed, their appetites suddenly and inexplicably diminished. In the days that followed, the entire village was abuzz with speculation and rumor about what fate had befallen the infamous Obinna. Some whispered that the elders had imprisoned him, while others claimed that he had been banished from the community altogether. A few even suggested that the young man had been subjected to some kind of ancient ritual or curse, a punishment befitting his egregious offenses against the village. But the truth, as it would soon be revealed, was even more extraordinary than any of their imaginings. For the elders of Obodo had devised a fate for Obinna that would forever change the course of his life, and perhaps even serve as a cautionary tale for generations to come. Please subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories ahead, if you haven't done so. After being forcibly dragged away by the two burly men on the orders of the chief, Obinna had been taken to a secluded meeting place deep in the heart of the village, where the elders had gathered to deliberate on his punishment. This was no ordinary council, but rather a convening of the most respected and revered members of the community, the traditional healers, spiritual leaders, and keepers of ancient Igbo wisdom. As Obinna was brought before them, bound and trembling, the elders regarded him with a mixture of disappointment and resolve. They had watched with growing consternation as his gluttony had spiraled out of control, undermining the very fabric of village life. And now, after his shameful display at the Yam harvest feast, they had determined that drastic measures were necessary to rein in his insatiable appetite and restore balance to the community. The chief, Nnamdi, stood and addressed the young man, his voice stern and unyielding. "Obinna, you stand before us today accused of the grave sin of gluttony, a vice that has not only brought shame upon your own name, but has also threatened the harmony and well-being of our entire village," he said. "Your endless consumption has disrupted the natural order, depriving others of their rightful share and placing an undue burden on our communal resources." Obinna opened his mouth to protest, but Nnamdi raised a hand, silencing him. "Do not attempt to deny your transgressions," the chief continued, "for we have all borne witness to your shameless behavior. Time and time again, you have demonstrated a complete disregard for the needs of your fellow villagers, indulging your cravings without a moment's hesitation." The elders around him murmured in agreement, their expressions grave and solemn. "And now," Nnamdi said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "the time has come for you to face the consequences of your actions. The elders have deliberated, and we have decided on a punishment that we believe will finally curb your insatiable appetite and teach you the value of discipline and restraint." Obinna's eyes went wide with a mixture of fear and defiance. He had never imagined that his love of food could lead him to such dire straits, and the prospect of facing the wrath of the entire village council was a daunting one. "What will you do to me?" he asked, his voice quavering slightly. I didn't mean any harm. I was just following my natural urges, like any other person would." Nnamdi fixed him with a stern gaze. "Your natural urges have become a cancer upon our community, Obinna," he said. "They have robbed us of our resources, disrupted our traditions, and undermined the very foundations of our way of life. And for that you must be held accountable." The chief then turned to the other elders, nodding to them in a silent signal. Instantly, several of the older men rose from their seats and began to move towards Obinna, their faces set with a grim determination. Obinna instinctively recoiled, his heart racing with fear. "What are you going to do?" he cried, his voice cracking. "Please, I beg you, have mercy." But the elders did not heed his pleas. Instead, they began to chant in a low, sonorous tone, their words flowing together in a rhythmic incantation that seemed to vibrate through the air. Obinna felt a strange tingling sensation begin to spread through his body, and he strained against his bonds, desperately trying to break free. Suddenly, the chanting reached a crescendo, and the elders raised their hands in a sweeping gesture. Obinna felt a surge of power course through him, and his jaw began to stretch and elongate, growing larger and larger until it took on the massive proportions of an elephant's trunk. The young man let out a great trumpeting cry of shock and dismay, his eyes wide with terror, as he realized the transformation that had taken place. The elders looked on, their expressions inscrutable, as Obinna struggled futilely against his new, unwieldy appendage. "There. Now you have the jaw to match your immense appetite," Nnamdi declared, his voice ringing with a note of finality. Perhaps now you will learn to control your endless hunger and to consider the needs of others before your own." Obinna could only stare at the chief in disbelief, his mind reeling from the sheer audacity of the punishment that had been inflicted upon him. How could this be happening? He had always taken such pride in his prodigious appetite, seeing it as a sign of his strength and vitality. And now, with the stroke of a few words and a mystical ritual, the elders had stripped him of that very thing, turning his greatest asset into a curse. The other villagers, who had been summoned to witness Obinna's fate, began to murmur and whisper among themselves, their expressions a mixture of awe, horror, and barely concealed satisfaction. Some shook their heads in pity, while others openly gloated over the young man's comeuppance. "Now he'll have to eat like the rest of us," one of the women muttered, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "Maybe he'll finally learn some humility." Obinna, his face flushed with a mixture of shame and outrage, turned pleading eyes towards the chief, desperate to find some shred of mercy in the old man's weathered features. "Please, Nnamdi," he begged, his voice cracking with desperation. "You can't do this to me. This is a fate worse than death." But the chief only regarded him with a stern, unyielding gaze, and his expression unreadable. "The decision has been made. Obinna," he said, his voice as cold and uncompromising as the granite cliffs that towered over the village, "and it is not ours to overturn. You have brought this upon yourself through your own selfish and gluttonous ways. Now, you must live with the consequences." With that, Nnamdi turned and gestured to the other elders, who began to file out of the meeting place, their robes swishing against the packed earth. Obinna strained against his bonds, his new elephant-like jaw swinging wildly as he called out to them, begging for mercy. But the elders did not look back, their faces set in grim determination. They had spoken, and their decision was final. As the last of the elders disappeared from view, Obinna was left alone, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and despair. He had always known that his insatiable appetite would one day lead to trouble, but he had never imagined that the consequences would be so severe or so humiliating. With a great shuddering sigh, he slumped against the bonds that held him, his new, oversized jaw dragging against the ground. The weight of his newfound appendage was a constant, inescapable reminder of the punishment that had been inflicted upon him, and he could not help but wonder how he would ever adapt to this strange, alien form. For hours, Obinna sat in solitude, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He replayed the events of the past few days in his mind, desperately searching for some way to undo the elder's curse. But try as he might, he could find no loophole, no means of escape from the fate that had been thrust upon him. Eventually, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the sound of approaching footsteps reached Obinna's ears. He looked up, his heart racing, to see two of the village men he recognized approaching him, carrying a bundle of what appeared to be clothing and supplies. Obinna, one of them said, his voice gruff but not unkind, "The elders have instructed us to bring you these things to help you adjust to your new condition." Obinna eyed the bundle warily, his new jaw swinging back and forth as he regarded the men with a mixture of trepidation and curiosity. "What is this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It is food, and some tools to help you learn to eat with your new mouth," the other man replied, a faint hint of pity in his tone. "The elders want to ensure that you do not starve, but they also expect you to use these items with restraint and discipline." Obinna felt a surge of anger at the implication, but he held his tongue, knowing that any further defiance would only lead to more punishment. Instead, he simply nodded, his eyes downcast. The two men approached him cautiously and began to untie the bonds that held him in place. Obinna tensed, half expecting those to attack him, but they merely helped him to his feet, steadying him as he struggled to adjust to the unfamiliar weight and movement of his new jaw. Once he was standing, the men handed him the bundle, which contained a selection of carefully prepared meals, as well as a set of wooden utensils and a series of intricate diagrams that appeared to show different techniques for eating. "The elders want you to practice with these," one of the men said, his tone solemn. "They say that you must learn to control your appetite and to consider the needs of others before your own." Obinna nodded again, his mind racing. He could scarcely believe that this was happening to him, that the elders had seen fit to punish him in such a dramatic and life-altering way. But as he stood there, holding the bundle of supplies in his massive, elephant-like jaw, he knew that there was no escaping the reality of his situation. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. I will do as the elders have instructed." The two men nodded, their expressions inscrutable, and then turned and began to make their way back towards the village. Obinna watched them go, feeling a growing sense of isolation and despair settle over him. For a long time he stood there alone, staring down at the bundle in his hands and trying to make sense of all that had happened. How could his love of food have led him to this? How could the elders have been so cruel? But as he mulled over these questions, a realization began to dawn on him. Perhaps in their own way, the elders were not being cruel at all. Perhaps they were trying to teach him a valuable lesson, one that he had been too stubborn and blinded by his own desires to see. With a heavy sigh, Obinna lowered himself to the ground, carefully placing the bundle in front of him. He then began to examine the contents, his new, oversized jaw moving with clumsy, uncertain motions as he tried to make sense of the tools and diagrams. It was going to be a long and difficult process, he knew. Learning to eat with this strange, alien appendage would not be easy, and he would have to fight against every instinct in his body to resist the urge to simply gulp down his food as he always had. But as he thought about the shame and humiliation he had brought upon himself and his community, he knew that he had no choice but to try. And so, with a newfound sense of determination, Obinna set to work, slowly and carefully practicing the techniques that the elders had provided. It would be a long and arduous journey, but he was determined to prove to the village that he could change, that he could learn to control his appetite and become a more disciplined, self-aware member of the community. As the weeks turned into months, the once gluttonous Obinna found himself in the midst of a profound transformation both physically and mentally. The punishment inflicted upon him by the elders of Obodo Oma village had proven to be a daunting challenge, but one that he was determined to overcome. With his massive, elephant-like jaw constantly serving as a reminder of his past transgressions, Obinna had no choice but to adapt to his new reality. Gone were the days of mindlessly wolfing down plate after plate of food, driven solely by his insatiable hunger. Now, every meal required meticulous planning, careful consideration, and a level of self-discipline that the young man had never before experienced. The set of wooden utensils and the detailed diagrams provided by the elders became Obinna's constant companions as he navigated this strange new world. He would spend hours each day practicing the intricate techniques for eating with his unwieldy jaw, painstakingly maneuvering the food into his mouth and chewing with deliberate, measured movements. At first, the process was incredibly frustrating and humiliating. Obinna would often find himself spilling food down the front of his shirt or accidentally knocking over his dishes, his elephant-like jaw swinging wildly as he struggled to maintain control. The other villagers, who had once watched in awe and exasperation as he devoured his meals, now regarded him with a mixture of pity and barely concealed amusement. "Look at him, the mighty Obinna, reduced to eating like a newborn baby," one of the women would mutter under her breath, eliciting snickers from her companions. But Obinna refused to be deterred. He knew that the eyes of the entire village were upon him, and he was determined not to let the elders' punishment be in vain. With grim determination, he persisted day after day, painstakingly mastering the techniques and slowly, painfully, regaining control over his appetite. And as the weeks turned into months, something remarkable began to happen. Obinna's clumsy, awkward movements gradually transformed into a fluid, graceful rhythm. He learned to anticipate the weight and momentum of his oversized jaw, adjusting his posture and the angle of his head to compensate. And most importantly, he discovered a newfound sense of restraint and discipline when it came to his eating habits.